Welcome to Creative Leadership with Heart, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of creative leadership. I'm your host, Rico Nasol. Join me as we explore the transformative impact of heart-centered leadership in today's creative and design organizations. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Creative Leadership with Heart. Today, I am talking with Adrian Pittman. He is a product design leader, formerly led teams at Google and LinkedIn, and he's currently at Cash App. If you haven't heard of Cash App, you're probably living under a rock, but they're in financial services. They do things like peer-to-peer and crypto trading. Adrian, thanks for taking the time out of your day to be here.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and so let's just get into it. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as a creative in design, what attracted you to design? How did you get to where you are? I'd love for folks to just get an idea of your journey.
Sure. The short version was I got into design through illustration. I was a commercial illustrator and had always loved drawing and painting and thought that that was going to be the thing that I pursued. And then I learned that, there's no money in it. So, so I, I started to explore other avenues. And about that time, as the web was becoming a more critical part of a lot of businesses' strategy, I was getting asked to do a lot of like, hey, this great design that you did, can you also do it on the web? And so I taught myself how to do, HTML, CSS, real basic stuff. And that actually got me into coding, where I started doing like ActionScript, Cold Fusion, doing a lot of front end style work. And so for a while, I was a designer engineer. Eventually, the tech stacks evolved to the point where most companies required that you pick a lane. You couldn't do both. And so I decided that lenting code for the rest of my life, fighting with, bug bashes and things of that nature wasn't exactly where I wanted to spend my days. So I just went ahead and pivoted all the way into design. And that was about the time that it started to become an industry, much the way it is today, where, product design for mobile in particular was coming up. So it just was a natural evolution. I just sort of made the next obvious choice each step of the way. Then I started leading teams and discovered that I really liked the mentoring and sort of painting with the brushes of a lot of different talent rather than just what I was capable of doing at my desk. And that kind of brought me to where I am today, where I went through, media and then healthcare, financial services, and, spent some time in social media as well. So covered a lot of industries.
Yeah, nice. Thanks for sharing that. And through that, I've had similar experiences in different kinds of industries. What would you say is your personal mission, or what is it about creative that keeps you going and going and going?
Um, It's an interesting, so the 2 things, I'll take them in reverse order. The thing that keeps me going is that there's never going to be an end to problems to solve to make things better for people. And I've always been more motivated by the problem than even the product. I think the product is sort of an output of your understanding, grasp, and execution on solving the problem. And the fact that there's no done is what keeps me going. So I'm always sort of wheels are always turning about some new challenge that is really, a problem for someone or an opportunity to engage someone. And I just start getting excited about ways in which I can bridge that gap. But yeah, what that was, and that's kind of my mission too. I mean, I get into it with a love of the problem, as kind of backwards as that sounds. Because for me, it really is about understanding how we can make things better for people, first and foremost. So it's always, whenever we're working on something as a team or a company, I'm always asking to what end? Whatever decision we're making, what is the end result that we expect to get out of it? If we're not sure about that, then we need to go back and clarify that before we do anything.
Yeah, that's great. Um, and last time we chatted, there was something that interesting that organically came up, and I think it's a great thing for us to get into before we get to some of the other things, because this is something that I struggled with, and I know some other folks that I work with, like on a coaching front, struggle with, and that's the idea that design is a service organization, right? Or you and I don't believe that's true, but in some cases, it just ends up working out that way. I'd love to hear your thoughts on one, is that something you experience? And two, what are, if you've had to experience it, what are things that can help move design from a service organization to having an equal, if not larger, seat at the table?
So, I mean, that's it's an interesting the way you frame the question is interesting because it doesn't automatically mean that just because design is a service that it doesn't have a seat at the table. It might be structured a little bit differently. It's more about ownership and what part of the surface, what part of the experience, what problem part of the problem set do you own? It can't just be a process. It has to actually be an outcome. And it's a lot harder for that to be true when you are treated as a service. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not at the table. You may very well be at the table just for a limited time or a certain stage in the process. Agency obviously works that way, or historically has worked that way, more so than product. I think it has a lot to do with the culture of the company and sort of the age of design versus the age of some of the other functions. What can sometimes happen is a company or organization can get used to simply not having a person represent the design or user experience aspects as their equal working together. And so they just get used to solving the problem without that piece. And then there's a sort of a recasting that has to happen when suddenly design is available, pulling them into the discussion, reframing the process and the methods so that you can engage design earlier and throughout the process. And that can sometimes be an evolution. I've also seen companies that have, because out of necessity, have started evolving the other way, where design was you had for each individual key vertical remit, you had a POC for design, but there just aren't enough bodies. Perhaps the team has shrunk, they have backfill that they're not able to fill at the moment, and so they've started to move back in the direction of, uh, you know, a more service oriented model. I can't say that one is totally worse than the other. I would prefer to be there at the beginning and all the way through. I think that continuity is helpful because design is a strategic function, and it's easier for a person to cognate the challenge and really get embedded in understanding the challenge. But it has pluses and minuses because the other side of it is that it creates verticals that, can sort of verticalize and silo knowledge sharing or knowledge gathering, which can make it very difficult for the product organization. So, I think that really what it boils down to is making sure that design is co-owner in the problem and solutioning for the problem, and that they're brought in at the beginning with everyone else. When it's first introduced into the organization as a strategic priority, there should be a design perspective just as much as there is a product or or marketing perspective as well. Otherwise, you are effectively just a part of a process, not a part of a solution set.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, right? The design perspective, because I think that's in some cases what's missing from some organizations, right? It's almost like they throw the ball over the wall, right? So like product managers are like, hey, we have this thing, we already have an idea of what we want to make, and then we'll just throw it over the wall to design so they can. And this is, you may not like this analogy. I don't even like using it, but I'll use it so we can all understand. It's like we'll throw the cake over the wall for the icing and the toppings, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
when you have that kind of relationship, that's when not so great products are made, right? Because design and the simple usability aspects of a product sometimes can be overlooked. And that's the perspective usually that design will bring in, is like all this other stuff can be noise. And do we need it all? Because we're essentially trying to go from A to B. You don't need tertiary D, X, K, J, all the other things. Um,
Yeah. No, just to strain your analogy even farther, we used to say it's like, working on the frosting before you've baked the cake. And so what you'll see is it's like, oh, I want to see, and I see this in the industry. It's a thing that it disturbs me more the more I see it, is this notion that high fidelity, as if real comps are where you start. And a lot of teams don't work in earlier, lower fidelity frameworks. They're talking to leadership with finished frameworks where the thought processes are not aligned with the fidelity. Um, And so as a result, you end up making decisions because it looks good, but not necessarily because it's the best, most operable solution to the problem. And so that's why you see like these really pretty apps. There's a lot of really great, proposed solutions out here operating as applications and products. But in many cases, when you get into the weeds on the day-to-day operation, they don't work all that well. Or
Mhm.
there's key areas that are just obvious blind spots. It's like, how the heck did they miss that? And I think that happens because you're starting at high fidelity too early. Because again, the idea is like, well, we already have the answer to the problem. We don't really need to think about it anymore. But again, design is a strategic function. It's all of that thinking and that analyzing and that decomp that happens before the final high fidelity production is done. That's the real work that design is responsible for. The pretty stuff is at the very end. That's the easy part once you've actually taken care of actually solving the fundamental problem and establishing those frameworks.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing I'd want to ask you is, I know I had earlier in my career I had to struggle with this. Is I didn't want to put what maybe looked like half baked designs out because it wasn't represent a good representation of my work. So for you, I don't know if you struggled with this, but I'm sure you ran into it with people that reported to you in your career. How do you balance that where someone's maybe earlier in their career desire to put out quality work versus to what you said is lo-fi initial comps be will help vet the entire thing much better, much quicker, as opposed to high fidelity polished round one versions of stuff. So how do you help, or what advice would you give folks that struggle with putting out not their best work, but in the vein of put out early and often?
Well, again, I mean, what is quality? It can be subjective if it's not nailed to the floor with a definition. And I think a lot of times that's the biggest problem is that there's this shifting understanding of what quality is, both by function and also by level. And craft, as I like to say, craft is what ships. So it's not enough that one part of the machinery work really well. The whole thing has to work all the way to execution. So if it's really pretty in this high fidelity version that we saw when we were all considering it as a concept, but the realized version of it is rough and ready because it's been degraded and de-res because of all these concessions that we've had to make just to get it produced, cutting out priorities and deprioritizing really important things for the user just to keep it cheap and fast. That's not craft. And I think a lot of organizations could benefit from just a resetting of an understanding of like everyone owns craft. Craft could be design led, but it's not design owned. And so you can't have craft if engineering is laden with tech debt and they can't build the solution that they need to build because the infrastructure isn't there, or product research is not the design research is not given the opportunity to actually bring in insights and synthesize a subset of behaviors or a target that we can measure against from a experience perspective. Like all these things matter, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of times those things are out of alignment. That's really what has an impact on it. So then, back to your analogy, as an individual, I see you are no longer able to feel like pride in your work because you're like, well, yeah, the version that I got agreement on initially looked like this and it was beautiful. And we all thought it was going to be great and had all these features and things we wanted to do. But the version that launched that you can actually see when you go to the URL or you download the app is a lower level version, a lower fidelity version of that original idea. And so you start to feel really bad about losing those battles all the time. But again, if you go back to the fundamentals, it's what is craft, what is quality, that has to be defined at the top because that's the only way teams can horizontally orient towards a common goal and a common bar and hit it consistently every time. And so therefore it's often not your fault. You'll feel like it's your fault, but it may not always be your fault, right? You
Yeah,
may not
yeah.
have been had any ability to influence it whatsoever because the problem was upstream of you.
Yeah, I've run into that a lot. It's like the MVP. You keep getting an MVP. Like let's just get something out. And then yeah, to your point, all the concessions are made, and then what you started off in the beginning had lofty goals. Now is like a shadow of what that was. Um,
Yeah. The goals have to be realistic, though. I think the other, the opposite end of that is that, design will kick out something, or the aspirations are far beyond what's needed. It's
mhm,
like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could build this thing? Well, does anybody actually need that thing? Does that solve an actual problem? Because we're not doing this, to satisfy ourselves and our creative influences. We're doing this to actually help people, have better experiences or have better outcomes or whatever the goals are. So a lot of times it's, the conversation I'm having with my teams, and I did the same thing when I was in IC, is ask it questions, which is the principle of just like, okay, look at the thing in front of you. Like when I was a painter, I would step away from the canvas every so often just to look at the whole thing. Did those brushstrokes that I added, do they fit with the rest of the image or not? Is there anything that's out of alignment or imbalanced? And you have to step away from the work, take yourself out of the work and your attachment to it perhaps, and look at it objectively. Say like, okay, look, I'm putting it up for crit, but I'm also critiquing it myself. And like, if I do this, what happens after that? What happened right before the thing that I'm designing, right? Am I setting people up for success? These are questions you can ask to raise the bar of your own work. That way, if you are showing something that is not the version that went into the product, but it's the version that you believe in, that you're convicted about, you could describe and speak to those convictions in an interview, when you're talking to someone else about the project or whatever, because you have thought about it. That's evident. Your thinking is evident in the work and also in your discussion of the work.
yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's a challenge that people go through. And pivoting to that, what is a challenge that either you're facing now or maybe the biggest challenge you faced in your career so far?
That's a It's an interesting question because there's a timely version of it, which is just companies are a lot of the large organizations that have historically maintained, very large staffs with, well-resourced and equipped teams are finding that they have to tighten the belt a little bit, or maybe a lot of it, to still get from A to B, and maintain profitability. And so that results in layoffs. And I'm sure there you throw a rock, you know someone that has, either themselves or people that they know directly within their cohort that have been impacted by that. I think that the realization is that there are a lot of really talented people that are being laid off. And if it were a matter of performance alone, then it would be, a little bit more, it'd be a little easier to take. You'd be like, well, at the end of the day, this was like they were cutting off the lower performing aspects of the organization. But that's not what's happening, like at all.
Mhm,
It's
yeah.
a mixed bag across the board. And so that has a direct impact on morale. And so if you're leading a team at a company where, a lot of design leaders, particularly middle management, they don't really get the choice to say, I don't want to let anybody on my team go, or I can't afford to let anybody on my team go. They might be made to make those choices and then represent those choices to a team that's looking to them for guidance, leadership, and protection. And so being a leader in this time right now is really, really stressful, and it weighs on me to. I've only fortunately had to deal with layoffs maybe twice in my career, and that's just luck of the draw, where I moved on before layoffs happened, or I just happened to be in an area that wasn't targeted for them. But it does happen. It will happen. I would say to any new or aspiring leader, you will at some point in your career have to look someone in the eye and give them their pink slip or give them their papers. It's really important to maintain your sense of humanity when you do that. The worst thing you could do is execute a heartless routine that terminates someone's employment without ever having the conversation with them, why, or just meeting them where they are on that process, because at some point you're going to need to hire, and the way you treat people when things are bad is a direct reflection of how you'll be thought of when things are good. And these are people that they never want to work with you again, certainly at the company that you work for represent again. So I think it's important to just think that through, and I give that a lot of thought lately. It's like, am I doing anything that's going to make me not useful to the organization I work for because I can't, attract and retain talent. That's probably the biggest thing on my mind at the moment, in
Yeah.
addition to some of the more day-to-day things I deal with at work.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point, and I'm glad you brought it up, right? Because one, it should never get easy. So if you've done this heartless thing, like I would then question why you are even a leader in the first place, right? Because I
Right.
had to do I'm lucky too. I had only to do it twice. Once during the 2009, 2010 Great Recession then, and then earlier last year, I had to when I was at out school, I had to let a few people go. So it's never easy. Um, and yeah, I mean, you don't know when you'll run into them again, but it's also, you know, these are people. They're humans. They have families, they have like people that they have to support and be there for. And so even though you have to go through this act, there's a human way and a way to deal with compassion and kindness and still be available to them after. Um,
Yep.
so
Yep. Yep.
that's a great I'd love to hear how you've thought about it, how you've dealt with it in the past, and if there's any advice or places people can go to help them deal with these situations.
And you're referring to,
Having to deal with
layoffs
like
specifically or
risks
just
or just even just
friction?
conflict, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
friction or conflict when they have to do the hard things, even sometimes when they're not part of the decision.
Yeah. So, you have to, a lot of these things are mitigated by building a bridge of trust between you and the person that, either you work for or that reports to you, whatever the structure is. That that covers a multitude of challenges because if at the end of the day, the person, you're talking to truly understands and believes that your motivations are good and that you have, their best interests in mind as well, then there's a lot more this you can have the tougher conversations and they don't have to be that tough, right? Whether that's a corrective conversation, or it's a pivot to strategy that moves a person off of something that they were really, attached to and excited about. I've had conversations where, individuals on my team, we've had to kill certain strategic investments, and there were things that they were really personally invested in. It's like, don't worry, it's not going to damage your career. I'm going to work and help and make sure that we get you into a remit that makes sense. And don't take it personally or anything of that nature, because sometimes it just happens. Um, but you can say that all day long, but at the end of the day, the only thing that really the difference between them believing you and not believing you is, do they trust you? And so, a lot of times, not a lot of times, I have seen it happen. And I even did it when I was a young manager, where you go through doing the thing, just acting and not thinking and not
Mhm.
preparing for. And so then you get into a situation where things are a little crunchy and it becomes a conflict. It's a friction point. Everyone's hair is on end, because the trust wasn't built. Day one, first thing you need to start working on is developing the trust. You have to be able to understand them. They have to feel like you're listening, that you actually care. I try to recite back things that they've mentioned to me before. I'll quote them to them when I'm talking to them in my one-on-ones with them to show that I am listening. I'm a copious note taker for that reason. I give credit where credit is due. If an idea that I came up with was inspired by something that someone else on my team said or someone else said somewhere else, I always try to cite the source, right? And then I always try to give recognition when there's really cool things that they're doing, because in some cases, that might be the way that you build trust with them. Everybody's a little different. You got to understand their love language, but that might be the way you build trust with them. They're like, this person sees me, they hear me. And so when we get into a crunchy thing where, there's something that he wants, some behavior that he wants me to change or something like that, I'm not going to take it as a negative thing coming from him, because he's trying to help me. He has been trying to help me when it was good times, even when it's bad times. And that a lot of that is just down to your one and one, in my opinion, down to your one and one strategy. And being really present during your one and ones, having the one and ones, taking the notes, having an agenda, and just taking it really seriously. because that's how you get to discuss what an individual's needs are, and how they're doing, in addition to all the other tactical stuff that you might need to discuss with them, and serve the whole person, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of gold in there if people wanna rewind it and re-listen to that, because I think building trust, I agree with you, like, that's the foundation of anything, right? If people don't feel like you care, then nothing else matters, right? Like, that's the thing is, if you don't care them as a human being, then,
Right.
they won't work hard for you, you won't do things for them, all that stuff is built on trust, and that, I'm here for you in every single
Yeah.
way that you need me, whether it's professional, personal, whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's not what
I
you say, it's what you do. And I think that's the other side point to that, that the meta point is there is a style of leadership that that prioritizes being friendly, but being friendly doesn't mean you're a friend. And in some cases, you're an individual who you've never had any negative dealing with previously, uh, and has only ever been really polite to you, could end up being someone that is not on your side, and you only discover that in a time of need. And heaven help you if that's your manager, right? So, and I think there are a
yeah,
lot of leaders that are setting themselves and their teams up for self-sabotage because you can't just act. You have to actually do things
mhm,
that are demonstrating that that you mean what you say. And yet, in some cases, that's advocating for a person in their absence in a conversation with your colleagues or up channel for the sake of their career advancement. That's happened many a time.
yeah.
You're the voice in the room. They have to know that they have to have faith through the demonstration of your trustworthiness that you'll do that when the time comes.
Yeah, that's a amazing point, and one that I had to learn. I learned it earlier in my career, but I had to learn that, like, because oftentimes when I would be in these, like, large executive meetings, I'd be the only designer creative representation, and early in my career, I had so much imposter syndrome that I just wouldn't have anything to say. But it wasn't until I realized, like, no, I'm speaking for my entire organization, not just me, just not just my perspective, but I'm speaking for the creative design team. So I had to be more present and I had to push myself beyond, because I would be doing them a disservice if they didn't have, like, to do the earlier metaphor, the seat at the table, because I was that seat at the table. And if I wasn't earning their trust and representing their perspective, I was failing. So it's so important for leaders coming up to realize they're much more. When you're in a meeting, you're representing much more than yourself. You're representing everyone else that is following you and everyone else that doesn't have that voice or that seat. Um, I share this thing from Carla Harris. It's called the relationship currency. I don't know if you've heard of that, but I love it because she talks about how everything is about relationships, right? And so, like you said it well, is when you're not in the room, who's the one that's advocating for you? Who's the one that's speaking up for you? And who's the one putting the vote of confidence in you, right? When the layoffs are coming, who's the one to say, like, oh, I know Adrian. Adrian's amazing. He did these things, right? If you didn't have those relationships, no one may mention your name. So it's important for leaders and individual contributors to know that, like, building those relationships, those foundations are important for us as people just to connect in general, but even for professional development and to grow in your career.
Yep, and know
Mm.
it'll work for you. I mean, I can't stress enough how your usefulness to the company is goes through the floor if no one wants to work for you. They might as well just lay you off because if they're like, oh yeah, I was going to take that job, but then I met the guy that I was going to be reporting to, or the person I was going to be reporting to, I don't like them at all, right? And then
Mhm.
I did a little research, and their reputation is trash, right? Like to your earlier point, why be a manager? Why be you can go do something else because you're not helping anybody. And right now we have a lot of companies that have a lot of managers, quite a few of them are in the middle, but at the top that are making some decisions that are going to have negative consequences on their usefulness in the future. The way they treat people when they, terminate their service, again, not because they want to, but because they have to. But the way they go about doing it is setting up an expectation of when things go back the other way and they can hire again, what kind of talent they're going to get. They're not going to get the AAA talent. Those people are going to avoid them like the plague. So it's a very small world. This industry is
Mhm.
not that big. It's not that old, design, from a product design perspective, and it's not that large.
Yeah.
So
I
you're
was
probably 6 degrees from everybody you'll ever report to.
yeah, and I it's interesting because I saw a Forbes article this morning that said, somebody did like a poll of like 6,000 people of like the 200,000 something that got laid off, and like
Mhm.
86% of them said they would never go back to the company that laid them off.
I saw
So I
that
mean,
report
that's
too, actually.
telling, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
86% of people. So yeah, imagine the folks at better.com who what was it? He just had like 2,000 or 3,000 people on a Zoom call and said,
Yep.
"Hey, if you're on this call, you're no longer working here." Like
Yep.
that's terrible. And I know we
That's not
could
the way
go
to do it. Yeah.
on and on about this, but I want to move us on to some more advice and some mentors. So we talked about relationship currency, um, and I'd like one thing that I value and that I endorse is mentorship. So for you, who are you don't have to name them, but like what did they perhaps you can describe what it looked like, but who are some mentors that had impacts on you and how do you think that shaped, if it did or didn't, your career and where you are so far?
Interestingly, some of the people that have taught me the most weren't even formally mentoring me. There was just my interaction with them was very educational. Things they've said and done, things of that nature. I remember when I was first getting like like stuck into the design industry, and transitioning from illustration. And I was at a fairly early stage in my career, and a lot of the work I had a percentage of my work that was like synthetic. It weren't actual projects; they were projects that I sort of initiated to demonstrate my process and methodology and thinking. Um, but I was perfectionist, and everything wasn't exactly the way I would have liked to have seen it or would have liked to have done it, and I was still working on it. And I was showing it to this gentleman who was he was the creative director for an agency that I was applying for a position at. And he stopped me in the middle. I was apologizing, like, well, this is good, but I could definitely see how you could move this forward, or these colors are things that I really think are a good color combination to use, but I also want to try some of these other things in the future. And he stopped me and he said, you know, your work's really good. You don't have to keep apologizing for it. And I realized that we have a tendency, and it's not in all things. It's typically in specific areas to be really, really like aggressively critical of ourselves. And it's not to say that we should just like everything we do is perfect the moment it comes out of our head, but there's a certain point where it no longer is productive. And as you get more experience, you start to learn where that is. It's true as a leader too, because there's a certain point where there's a certain level of critique that's only going to tear the person down. It's not actually going to accomplish anything. You just have to let them figure it out for themselves and give them the room and safety to learn and make mistakes. Similarly, what I really learned in that moment was that's true for yourself as well. There's a point where it's like, look, nothing is ever going to be perfect. You can pursue perfection, but you'll never achieve it. So if you're going to critique yourself under the auspices of it didn't meet perfection, none of it's going to be good, and you're just going to burn yourself out. And it was just a passing thing, and it relaxed me once he said that, and I was able to go through the rest of it, the presentation, in a more conversational way. But it was always a formative moment that I just always remember.
Yeah, that almost dovetails perfectly into the next question is like, we got to wrap up here soon because we're running out of time. But what is one piece of advice you'd give? And you gave tons, don't get me wrong, you gave tons of advice in this one, some great stuff if people want to go back. But kind of to, if there's something that you want to leave with people that you haven't mentioned yet, what's the one thing you'd want to leave for creative leaders in the world today?
At the beginning of your career, ask a lot of questions. I don't mean, in fact, in general, as a rule of life, ask a lot of questions. That's, in my view, that's the seat of learning. But particularly in the early stages of a career, I I learn a lot more about a young leader or a young IC, like someone who's early in their career. I learn a lot more about them by the questions that they ask than anything else, because that tells me what their potential is. I know that I'm going to be investing in this person regardless. So the question is, is my investment going to be well placed or not? And it really comes down to how they think. And the easiest way, without having had enough experience yet to demonstrate how they think, is how they engage information and learn. And so the question asking is key. I see sometimes I'll sit down with young leaders, young designers, and they have very little to say unless asked. And that's fine, if it's an interview, I guess, but you definitely want to have some questions loaded. And I've gotten some really interesting, like deep digging questions from people who are just getting started in their career, and they're memorable to me as a result of that. In the middle of those that are sort of in that middle stage of their career where they're sort of moving towards senior, think about the broader impact beyond just your lane. So the things that you can do to help yourself, your career, and your team, especially if you're leading a team, is to think about how you can help the other functions accomplish their goal and how you can help accomplish the bigger goal by aligning more of that. So the more you understand about the writing challenges and the research challenges and behavioral insights and the engineering challenges and the technical infrastructure limitations or abilities, the gaps, the deltas, the product management goals when they have meet plan goals or helping them better achieve their North Star goals for measurement for their performance. All of that is a tide that lifts all boats. Now you suddenly become a leader of a product strategy rather than just a function. And that's really where you can have the most impact, both again for your team, your career, and the organization that you're in.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I those are definitely words of live by. Like the questions, I know I've gotten much farther in my career and have had to evolve that kind of approach, even in interviews and stuff now. So yeah, those are all great things. And to wrap, Adrian, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, learn more about what you're doing, um, or even reach out to you to connect? Where's the best place for folks to find you?
Absolutely. So you can find me online at a11n.com. And that's the site that's continually evolving now to represent, things that I'm working on or have done. You can also reach out to me there. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Adrian Pittman.
Cool. Thank you. And I'll make sure to add those to the show notes. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, they'll definitely be in contact and then check out the links in the show notes. Thank you, Adrian, so much for taking the time out of
You.
your day to share with us. Thank you for sharing your perspective on creative and leadership. I know we could have gone like another hour probably and talked about stuff. So maybe we'll have you back. But thank you so much again. And again, you can find them a11n.com, right?
That's right.
And
That's
LinkedIn.
right.
All right, Adrian. Thank you so much.
LinkedIn. All right.
All right, I'll see you
Thank you.
next time in the next one. Take care. Thank you for checking out Creative Leadership with Heart. Make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. We have a lot more content coming out. So if you do subscribe, you'll get notified when we have new episodes. All right, take it easy. See you in the next one.